Hello, and welcome to week 3 of our clinical psychology class. We're going to have some interesting topics here. The chapter 7 is about diagnosis and classification issues, particularly talking about the DSM-5. Chapter 8 about the clinical interview, and then some more detailed assessments in chapter 9 in terms of intellectual and neuropsychological assessments. Chapter 10, personality assessments and behavioral assessments. So, what interests me is, of course, the DSM 5. And, we already have, since this book was published, we have now coming out the DSM 5 TR. And so TR stands for text revision. And so that's different than having like a whole new edition. So we don't have a DSM 6, but the text revision. And so here's like a little link that tells you about this TR. And as we're looking at this, some of the changes that has been made and that are coming out and are published already are some attention to culture, racism, and discrimination, which is something that you might appreciate after kind of reflecting on cultural competence. There are some diagnoses for children that have been changed. There's some coding. And there are some updated disorders, which is interesting. And so we have actually also a whole new disorder, which is about prolonged grief disorder. So if you go to this here, you can find all these different diagnoses. So it's interesting about the DSM 5. And so your discussion this week will actually be about noteworthy changes and criticism of the DSM. So I'll be interested to see if you are going to incorporate this new DSM, or you're going to stick to the textbook. It's up to you. But that'll be an interesting discussion. One of the aspects that we look at in terms of normalcy or abnormalcy is the question of what is normal versus abnormal behavior. And a lot of people talk about expected behavior in individuals. When I talk about abnormality, I think usually about these aspects. First of all, there's suffering involved. There's a lack of functioning where people it's harmful to their development or their functioning as a human being. It's culturally outside of the norm, or that's what they call about unexpected. It's sort of like the wrong behavior at the wrong time in the context. And culturally expected, of course, brings up some of these issues. It's like, what if somebody is transplanted into a different culture, or better yet, the clinician is from a different culture and is now judging the cultural normality of the client. So those are some of the issues. And of course, then there's also the facet of irrationality. If somebody is just not living in the realm of what we consider reality, that is also an aspect that can be included in abnormality. So that is your chapter 7. Let's turn to the clinical interview. So when we're talking about the clinical interview, and by the way, your task is going to be to teach new clinicians how to conduct clinical interviews. And this reminds me sort of like some of those micro skills. I mean, that's what it was called when I went to school. We had to learn some micro skills, which was sort of basics in, take a look at here, in the book, specific behaviors that are helpful. And my doctoral advisor, Wampold, would have said, these are the relationships, these are the skills to build a therapeutic relationship. So, our book talks about eye contact, body language, verbal tracking, etc. Okay, building rapport is like obviously really important, and that also talks about some technique. Now, what Wampold talks about, and here's a article by him, are 3 elements, and so he calls it the contextual model. And what that means is that we have to see the clinical interview or the clinical relationship within the context. And there are 3 aspects to it, and one is the real relationship, where you're looking for the therapeutic relationship built with the rapport that we talked about, or with Carl Rogers, humanist, being congruent and all those kinds of skills. The second area that he talks about is expectations, and that is clients come into the interview with an expectation or an explanation for themselves in regards to what is happening to them. And that needs to be eventually coming together in the therapeutic relationship or in these expectations for treatment, that we can't just put out there our perspective of what we perceive to be their diagnosis, but we have to come together with their expectations and also the explanation, not only what their disorder is, but also how it's going to be addressed. And the third area then that he talks about are the specific ingredients, and those are all treatment modalities, but they can only really take a hold if they are based in those expectations, which are developed within that factor one, the positive or the real relationship between the client and the therapist. There are also chapter 9 and 10. They're very interesting, and I hope that you enjoy this week. I look forward to seeing you and your work, and feel free, as always, to contact me with any questions or suggestions.